Your saving account is paying 3%. Inflation is running at 3.3%. You are losing money quietly every single month. And that gap is not an accident. Historically, when governments get debt levels above 100% of GDP, they rarely bring the debt down through spending cuts alone. Then, political cost is usually just too high. So instead, there is another path. One that is being used before. It is called financial repression. That basically means reducing the real burden of debt through inflation and interest rates that stay below inflation. In other words, cash savings lose purchasing power over the time, slowly, quietly, gradually, often without most people really noticing. Now, on May 15, the new Fed chair takes over, and when you compare his state policy agenda with what happened after 1946, some of the parallels are worth paying attention to. CNBC survived 30 economists, and most of them believe Warsh may not be able to deliver what Trump wants. Ironically, that could make the repression scenario more likely, not less. So, by the end of this video, you will understand how financial representation works, what it could mean for your savings right now, and which asset class performed best the last time governments used this playbook. So let's get into it. Now, this isn't just an US issue. Most developed economies are dealing with the same structural problem, but the US version matters more because of the dollar global role. The key metrics here is debt-to-GDP, and all that means is how much the government owes compared with the size of the economy. And this matters directly because it determines whether your savings keep their value or quietly lose it. After World War II in 1946, US debt to GDP was around 106%. Today is roughly 125, and the IMF projects it could reach 143% by 2030 if nothing materially changes. So this isn't small issue. One analysis from World Understood put in bluntly, the debt will likely be inflated away. The language is dramatic, but the math behind it is worth to understanding. Let me simplify this brutally. One analogy, and then we move on. Think of it like mortgage. You owe the bank 500,000. You have got two options. Options 1, earn more, spend less and slowly pay it down. And option 2, inflation reduce the real value of the debt over time. If inflation averages are 5% for long enough, that's the same 500,000 debt become far less mindful in today's purchasing power terms. You didn't really pay it off faster. Inflation just did part of the work, and that's the core idea here. Expect applied to 39 trillion of government's debt. Now, at another issue, interest cost. The US is paying around 1 trillion a year in interest alone. That is not the reducing the debt. That's just servicing, and it rising quickly. Federal Reserve's own data. Net interest outlays. Look at the line in the last 3 years. So what are the options? Spending cuts are politically painful. Tax hikes are unpopular, especially in election cycles, which leaves a third path. Reduce the debt burden gradually through negative real rates. No dramatic announcement, no emergency speech, just time, inflation and policy. And the people most affected tend to be disciplined savers who think they are doing the responsible thing. What's happened in 1940s is exactly why your savings matter today, because the same setup may be returning. And here is the template. So has this happened before? Yes. After World War II, the US had a debt problem even larger than today relative to GDP. And the solution wasn't rapid repayment. It was a long period of repression. Here is what that looked like. First, rates stayed very low. Your bank account might earn 1%. Second, inflation ran higher, sometimes 5 to 7%. So, in real terms, savers were losing purchasing power each year. Third, the governments borrowed cheaply while inflation did the heavy lifting. And fourth, the economy grew. So, even if debt stayed high in nominal dollars, it shrank relative GDP. That helped bring debt to GDP down from roughly 106% in 1946 to around 25% by 1970s. Not because the debt was heroically paid off, because growth and inflation changed the ratio. BlackRock has pointed out that for much of the post-war era, interest rates stayed below nominal growth rates. That is essentially the environment repression needs. Now imagine being a saver in 1950s. You work hard, you save consistently, you buy bonds because that seems prudent, and year after year inflation quietly eats into purchasing power. Meanwhile, the government's balance sheet improves. Most people never describe it as a transfer, but economically that's what it was. And the same setup may be returning now, because the debt numbers today are worse than 1946. And the policy agenda, as of my 50, rhymes. Now here is the important difference today. Back then, much of the debt was locked in for longer maturities. Today, a lot more debt rolls over far more frequently, which means if rates fall, the governments can save money much faster. And if rates fall below inflation, the repression mechanisms start working again. Now let's talk about Kevin Warsh. He takes over on May 15, and based on his public comments, there are three broad ideas for watching. First, lower rates. Second, more reliance on private demand for treasury bond. And third, shrinking the Fed balance sheet while trying to contain inflation. Now, taken individually, each of these ideas can be defended. But taken together, they resemble parts of the post-war template. That doesn't automatically mean intent. It means incentive structure. Morningstar has made the basic point clearly. When rates sit below inflation, debt burdens fall in real terms, and the cost land disproportionately on savers and fixed income holders. To be fair, Warsh argues AI productivity could justify lower rates without causing inflation. That may be right, but from a saver's perspective, intent matters less than outcome. If your savings earn 2.75% while inflation is around 3.3%, you are losing purchasing power either way. And CNBC Economist survey in April 2026 found many still expect oil prices to keep core inflation elevated this year. And if that happened, getting rates below inflation become easier, and the gap could widen. Enough context. Here is what this means in practice. Who wins and who loses in financial representation? Because historically the pattern is consistent and it is counterintuitive. So what does all this mean in practice? Who wins and who loses? Historically, the losers tend to be cash savers, bondholders with fixed yield, retirees relying on fixed income. Basically, people following convention, save money advice. The winner tend to be owner of real assets, things like property, equities, gold. because real assets often reprice with inflation over time, while fixed cash claims do not. This isn't a new dynamic, it's an old one. Morningstar has highlighted gold, real estate and equities as historical hedge in a repression-like environment. And central banks are globally bought large amount of gold in 2025. That may reflect reserve diversification, inflation concern, or geopolitical hedging. Either way, it is notable. Now, to be balanced here, if inflation stays high enough, Warsh may not be able to cut rates at all. In this case, cash and short-term bill could remain attractive little longer. So this isn't a one-way intermediate trade. Timing matters, but structurally, highly indebted governments always have an incentive to prefer lower real rates. That's the bigger point. But here is the part of the story that most financial videos skip entirely. The 1940s repression didn't happen through rate policy alone. There was a regulatory dimension, and it is worth understanding because Warsh addressed it directly. There is one more angle people often miss. Historically, repression wasn't only about interest rate. It also involved regulation. In the 1940s and after, banks, insurance, and pension funds were often steered towards government's debt through policy rules and incentives. Regulation Q is one example. It placed limits on certain deposit rates, which helped keep funding costs low. There were also yield caps and other mechanisms that supported treasury financing. So, when Warsh says private demand can fill the gap naturally, that's worth for watching. Maybe he is right, but historically, natural demand was often helped by regulation. That's why future signals matter. Things like pension rule change, capital requirements adjustments, liquidity rules, incentives favoring sovereign bonds. Any policy shift that make government debt structurally more attractive deserves attention. That is usually where repression becomes visible. Governments with too much debt historically choose inflation over austerity. If that happens again, cash loses quietly, real assets tend to win, and the signal to watch aren't headlines. They are regulatory shift, pension rule change, capital requirements adjustments. That's where it becomes visible first. The video is already being researched. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments, do you think this process has already started?